Welcome to Miss Retro Reads. We continue with Beau Geste. Chapter 2. Well, it was the last event on that remarkable program, mon cher, resumed de Beaujolais. A little later, a very appropriate and suitable one, too. An open-air entertainment concluded with fireworks. Fireworks? Rifle fireworks, do you mean? Asked Lawrence. No, just fireworks, works of fire. I will tell you. I let the moon get well up, then sent for the sergeant major and bade that good fellow to parade the men as before, with the fort 100 paces in the rear, the garrison esconded on the right of the line. This party would either march into the fort, or else the remainder would be ordered to right form and shoot them where they stood. If the remainder did not obey, I would at once give the order to pile arms. If they did this, as they might, from force of habit, they would immediately be marched off to the oasis by the non-commissioned officers and marched back to Tokotu under escort of the Sanglies to await court-martial. If they did not pile arms, the non-commissioned officers were to come once to me, and we would prepare to sell our lives dearly. It was a weird and not unimpressive scene. That sinister fort, silver and black, the frozen waves of the ocean of sand, the men like statues, inscrutable and still. What would they do? Would my next words be my last, as I faced the men? I was acutely interested, yet felt like a spectator, impersonal and unafraid. I was about to witness a thrilling drama, depicting the fate of one Henry de Beaujolais, quite probably his death. I hoped he would play a worthy part on that moonlight stage. I was calm. I was detached. George Lawrence sighed and struck a match. I cast one more look at the glorious moon and took a deep breath. If this was my last order, it should be given in a deep voice, clear and firm, above all firm. And as my mouth opened and my lower jaw moved in the act of speech, I believe it dropped, George, and my mouth remained open. For from the fort there shot a tongue of flame. "Regardez!" cried the sergeant major, pointing. Every head turned, and in the silence I heard him whisper, "Spirits!" That brought me to myself sharply. "Yes, imbecile," I said. "They carry matches and indulge in arson. Where is Rastignac?" For it was obvious that someone in the fort had set fire to something highly flammable. As I watched, another column of fire burst in a different place. "I told Corporal Brillet to tie him to a tree," said Dufour. I did not think it could be Rastignac's work, for he would not have entered the place even had he been at liberty to do so. Nevertheless, I ordered, "See if he is still there, and make sure that everyone else is accounted for." It was useless to detail a squad to put the fire out. In the desert, when a place burns, it burns. And my, how it burned! Anyway, to tell the truth, I did not care how completely it did go. This fire would be the funeral pyre of those brave men. It would keep my fools from mutiny, and it would purge the place of mystery. Incidentally, it would also save my life and military reputation. I gave the order to face about and stand at ease. The men should watch it burn. Perhaps they would then realize that human agency is required for setting a building on fire, and moreover, whoever was in there had to come out or be cremated. They should see him come. But who? Who and why? All stood absolutely still, spellbound, until suddenly a rifle cracked, again and again. From the sound, the firing was towards us. The Arabs were upon us. Far to the right and to the left, more shots were fired. Bullets whistled overhead, and I saw flashes from a distant sandhill. No one was hit, the fort being between us and the enemy, but in less time than it takes to tell, I had the men turned about and making for the oasis. There we could have cover and water, and if we could hold them until they were between us and St. Just's Senegals, we would avenge the garrison of that blazing fort. They are grand soldiers, those legionnaires, George. They are to infantry what my Cephas are to cavalry. It warmed one's heart to see them double back to the oasis, steady as on parade, every man select his cover and go to ground, his rifle loaded and leveled. Our camel vedettes rode in soon after that. Two of them had had a desperate fight, and two of them had seen rifle flashes and fired at them before returning to the oasis. They had thought the Arabs were burning the fort. In a few moments, the whole place was silent and apparently deserted. Nothing but a burning fort and a black, brooding oasis where nothing moved. What were the Arabs doing now? Probably preparing to rush us at dawn from behind the nearest sandhill. They would lull us into a scene of security and then come down upon us as we slept. But what if our waiting rifles caught them at 50 yards and the survivors turned to flee on to the muzzles of the Senegalese? I bethought me of getting into communications with St. Just. I reckoned he would soon be drawing near, and it was quite possible that he might run into the Arabs anyway. If he came in darkness after the flames at the fort had died down, he might march straight into a trap. It would be a good messenger that would reach St. Just. There was the track to find and follow, and there was the Arabs to face. On the whole, it might be better to send two. I went round the oasis until I found the sergeant major, and asked for a couple of men of the right stamp for my job. I was not surprised when he suggested the two Americans who had been in the fort with me. He recommended them as men who could use the stars and were good resourceful scouts. When I asked the big, slow giant and the little quick man if they would like to undertake this duty, they seemed more than ready. I found them of quick intelligence, and both repeated lucidly what I wanted them to say to St. Just, that he might be able to attack the attackers at dawn, just when they were attacking me. The two left on camels from the side opposite the fort, and after they had disappeared over a sandhill, you may imagine with what anxiety I listened for firing, but all was silent. After 2 or 3 hours of this unbroken stillness, the fire having died down in the fort, I felt certain there would be no attack until dawn. All who were not on guard duty slept, and as I strolled silently round the oasis waiting for sunrise, I thought over the incredible events of the day. My mind grew clearer as my body grew weaker, and I decided that all this was the work of a madman concealed in the fort, and now burned to death. But George, although my lunatic theory might account for these hopelessly lunatic proceedings, it hardly accounts for the Swiss officer having a confession that Micheals Geste had stolen a jewel, does it? It does not, my son, and that, to me, is the most remarkable fact in your most remarkable story, replied Lawrence. Well, I decided to leave it at that, continued de Beaujolais, and soon afterwards the sky grew gray in the east. Before dawn, we silently stood to arms, and when the sun peeped over the horizon, we beheld St. Just, Senegalese, skirmishing beautifully towards us. There wasn't so much as the smell of an Arab for miles. St. Just had not seen a living thing, not even the 2 scouts I had sent out to meet him, nor did anyone else ever see those 2 brave fellows again. I have often wondered what their fate was, Arabs or thirst. Anyway, I soon learned that one of St. Just's scouts had heard rifle shots in the direction of Zandernoof, and St. Just had increased his pace until he knew he must be near his goal. Then, fearful of an ambush, he had decided to halt for the rest of the night and feel his way forward in attack formation at dawn. He had done well, and while the weary troops rested, I told him all that had happened. He is a man with a brain, this St. Just, ambitious and a real soldier, a little dark-pocket Hercules of energy and force. When I had finished my account, and having fed, we were sitting against a fallen palm trunk with coffee and cigarettes, at hand, and he said, "Suppose your trumpeter killed the Swiss officer." "That never occurred to me," I said. "But why should he, and why use his bayonet and leave it in the body?" "Well, as to why he should," replied St. Just, "it might have been revenge, some injustice, when he was under this man at Sidi Bel Abbas, or elsewhere." "No," I said, "impossible. Why had not the Suez officer rushed up to the lookout platform when I approached? I fired my revolver to let them know that relief had come, and 2 answering rifle shots were fired. Why did he not rush down to the gates and throw them open?" "Wounded and laying down," suggested St. Just. "He was not wounded," said I. "That bayonet and nothing else had done his business." "Asleep," suggested the lieutenant, "absolutely worn out, and thus his enemy, the trumpeter, found him and drove the bayonet through his heart. The shot would have been heard, therefore he uses the bayonet, and he fled when he realized that the bayonet would betray him." "The officer's revolver, with 1 chamber fired?" I asked. "Oh, fired during the battle." "And the paper in his left hand?" "I do not know." "And who fired the 2 welcoming shots?" "I do not know." "And how did the trumpeter vanish across the desert before the eye of my company?" "I do not know." "Nor do I," I said. And then St. Just sat up suddenly. "Mon commandant," he said, "the trumpeter did not escape. He murdered the Suez officer, then hid himself. It was he who removed the 2 bodies when he was again alone in the fort. He may have had some idea of turning the stab into a bullet wound and returning to the company with some tale of who knows what. But since you had already seen the bayonet, he determined to set fire to the fort, burn all evidence, and rejoin in the confusion caused by the fire. He could swear that he had been knocked on the head and only recovered in time to escape the flames kindled by whoever had clubbed him. This is no more improbable than the actual fact of the case." "Quite so. But why did he not rejoin in the confusion?" "Well, suppose the Suez officer did shoot at him with the revolver and wounded him so severely that by the time he had completed his arson, he was too weak to walk. He fainted from loss of blood and perished in the flames that he himself had kindled. A splendid example of poetic justice." "Magnificent," I agreed. "The only flaw is that we should have heard the shot. In the heavy silence, a revolver would have sounded like a 75. "True," agreed St. Just, a little crestfallen. "The man was mad then. He did everything, then was probably burned alive." "Ah, my friend," said I, "you have come to a madman theory, huh? So had I. But now I will tell you something. The trumpeter did not do all this. He did not murder the Suez officer, for that unfortunate had been dead for hours, and the trumpeter had not been in the place 10 minutes. "That's that," said St. Just. "Let's try again." And he tried again, very ingeniously too. But he could put forward no acceptable theory. We were both, of course, weary to death, and more in need of 24 hours' sleep than 24 conundrums. But I do not know that I have done much better since. As I rode back to Tokotu with my bout of fever, at every stride of my camel my head opened and closed with a shuddering bang to the tune of "Who killed the commandant, and why?" till I found I was saying it aloud. I am saying it still. Passengers on the ship Apam from Lagos to Birkenhead were interested in 2 friends who sat side by side in Madeira chairs or walked the deck in constant company. It appeared the 2 had something on their minds, for, save for brief intervals of eating, sleeping, and playing bridge, they discussed interminably. When the Englishman contributed to the discussion, he spoke most often of a bareheaded man in a paper speculated as to the identity of the former and the authorship of the latter. The Frenchman, on the other hand, talked more of a murder, a disappearance, and a fire. "How long is it since you heard from Lady Brandon, Jolly?" inquired George Lawrence. "One glorious and invigorating morning at the Appam ploughed the blue bay of Biscay." "Oh, years," was the reply. "I was at Brandon Abbas for a week, about 6 or 7 years ago. I haven't written a line since the letter of thanks after the visit." "Do you correspond with her regularly?" No, I shouldn't call it regularly," answered George Lawrence. Then, with a simulated yawn, "Are you going to Brandon Abbas this leave?" "Well, I feel I ought to go and take that incredible document, but it doesn't fit in with my plans at all. I could post it to her, of course, but it would mean a long letter of explanation, and I loathe writing letters." "I'll take it if you like," said Lawrence. "I shall be near Brandon Abbas next week, and knowing Micheals Geste, I confess I am curious." Major de Beaujolais knew that curious was not exactly the right word. His friend had been stirred to the depths of his soul, and had given an exhibition of emotion such as he had never displayed before in all de Beaujolais' experience of him. He smiled to himself as he gravely replied, "But excellent, mon vieux. That would be splendid. You could say that, while the document is probably at Canard. I nevertheless think that she ought to have it." "Just that," agreed Lawrence. "Of course Beau Geste never stole the sapphire, or anything else, but a document like that ought to be hers and Geste, as their names are mentioned." "Certainly, mon ami, and if the stone has been stolen, the paper might be a clue to its recovery. Handwriting, for example, is a splendid clue. She could please herself as to whether she should put it in the hands of Scotland Yard." "Right-o, Jolly," was the reply. "I'll drop it there one day, though it looks to me as though the thief, the jewel, and the story all ended together in the burning of Zandernoof's fort." "I never thought of it before. The biggest and finest sapphire in the world may be lying at this moment among the burned-out ruins of Zandernoof Fort." "So it may," agreed Lawrence, and for a moment he had visions of devoting this leave to jewel-hunting and returning to Brandon Abbas with 750,000 francs worth of crystallized alumina in his pocket. He daydreamed a while. Of course, Lady Brandon and the sacrifice of his leave to the making of a great restoration, one which would elevate him in her eyes and make him worthy of her admiration. Sacrifice his leave? Nay, if necessary, his career, his whole life. Lawrence was awakened from his revelry by the voice of de Beaujolais. "Odd that it never got into the papers, George. I should think that every paper would have had an account of the theft of a famous jewel like that." "Yes, it is strange, but I should certainly have seen it if it had. Probably the thing wasn't stolen at all." And his friend agreeing, they dropped the subject of Beau Geste and the blue water and the secret of Zandernoof. On parting in London, Major de Beaujolais handed a document to George Lawrence, who promised to deliver it, and also to keep his friend informed as to the many developments of the story. The following day, as his hired car sped along the country road that led to Brandon Abbas, George Lawrence's heart was beating fast. Had she married him a quarter of a century ago, when she was plain Patricia Rivers, he would still have loved her, though he would not still have been in love with her. As it was, he had never been anything but in love with her from the time when he had taken her refusal like a man he was, and sought an anodyne by working in Central Africa. As the car entered the gates, he actually trembled, and his bronze face was changed in tint. He fingered his tie and tugged at his mustache. Driving around a shrubbery-enclosed square at the back of the house, he stopped at the big porch with a hospitably open door. From there he looked into a well-remembered paneled hall. He almost nodded at the 2 suits of armor that stood on each side of its big, doorless doorway, and then he looked towards the wide spiral staircase at the far end. Suddenly he pictured her descending in from 3 stories above with slow and stately grace, just as she had done on that first occasion when he had come to visit her again after her marriage. She had been married 7 years, and he had been 7 years in exile. He had entered this hall half in the hope that seeing her the wife of another man would cure him of the foolish love that kept him a lonely bachelor. Again and again, at intervals, he had visited the shrine, and nothing seemed to have changed. She had been married 7 years, and he had been 7 years in exile. Quickly he pulled the chain of the doorbell, and the butler appeared. "Hello, Burden," said Lawrence. "Why, Mr. George, sir," replied the old man, coming forward and looking unwontedly human. "This is a real pleasure, sir." It was a real £5 note, too, when Mr. Lawrence departed. "Her ladyship is at the Bower, sir, if you'd like to come straight out." He knew that the visitor was always welcome. "How is Lady Brandon?" inquired Lawrence as he followed Burden through the house. "She enjoys very good health, sir, considering." "Considering what?" "Everything, sir," was the non-committal reply. The visitor smiled to himself. A good servant, this. Then, "Is Mr. Michael here?" he asked. "No, sir, nor none of the other young gentlemen," was the reply. Was there anything unusual in the old man's tone? Crossing a rose garden, the pair followed a path that came out onto a square of velvet turf. On 2 sides rose the great old trees of the thickly forested hill, and from in front the hillside fell away to a famous view. By a wicker table a lady reclined in a chaise lounge. She was reading a book, and her back was towards Lawrence. The butler coughed at the right distance, and as Lady Brandon turned, announced the visitor, placed a wicker chair, and faded from the scene. "George," said Lady Brandon in her soft, deep contralto, with a pleased brighten of her grey eyes and a flash of beautiful teeth. She extended both hands, and he kissed them in a curious, reverent manner. "My dear Patricia," he said, looking long at the unlined yet mature and determined face before him, that of a woman 45 years old, of strong character and aristocratic breeding. "Yes, you are positively as beautiful as ever. And you as foolish, George. Sit down. Tell me why you have again disobeyed me and come here before your wedding, or are you married, George?" she asked, smiling. "No, Patricia, I am not married," said Lawrence, relinquishing her hand slowly. "I have disobeyed you because I hope you might be in need of my help. I fear you might be in need of my help, and hope that I might be able to give it." Lady Brandon fixed a penetrating gaze on Lawrence, a possibly wary one, he felt. "In need of help, George? How?" "Well, it is a longish story, but I need not inflict it on you if you'll tell me if Beau Geste is all right, and the blue water safe and sound, and all that, you know." "What?" There was no doubt now as to the alarm on Lady Brandon's face. "What are you talking about, George?" "Beau Geste and the blue water," replied Lawrence. "If I appear to be talking through my hat, there is a method in my madness." "There's madness in your method," replied Lady Brandon, a trifle tartly, and added, "Have you seen Michael, or what?" "No, I have not seen him, Patricia, but I have a document that reports to be his confession that he stole the blue water." "Then it was," whispered Lady Brandon, greatly perturbed. "But how and where did you get this confession? Tell me quickly." "It's a long story. It was found by Henry de Beaujolais at a place called Zandernouf in the French Soudan, in the hand of a dead man." "Not Michael?" interrupted Lady Brandon. No, a Frenchman. An adjutant in charge of the fort that had been attacked by Arabs. But look here, has the sapphire been stolen, Patricia? And, excuse the silly question, is this Beau's writing? He produced the dirty piece of paper from his pocket. Lady Brandon looked at it, her face hard, a puzzled frown marring the smoothness of her forehead. She read it, and then looked out across the green, as though communing with herself and deciding how to answer. "Tell me the whole story from beginning to end, George," she said at last, "if it takes you the week-end. But tell me this quickly. Do you know anything more than you have told me about Michael or the blue water?" "I know nothing whatever, my dear," was the reply, and the speaker thought he saw a look of relief on his hearer's face. Obviously there was something wrong, and in connection with Beau Geste, too. He wished she would be less guarded. It would be so easy to say, "My dear George, the blue water is in the safe in the priest's hole as usual, and Michael is in excellent health." Or, on the other hand, "The blue water has vanished, and so has Michael." As they strolled back to the house, "You aren't looking too well, George, my dear," she said, as they entered the wood. "Lot of fever lately," he replied. "Give it up and come home, George." He turned quickly towards her, and she added, "And let me find you a wife." Lawrence sighed and ignored the suggestion. "Where is the good Sir Hector Brandon?" he asked, as casually as he could. "Oh, in Kashmir, I believe. Thank you, George. Have you brought a suitcase?" I'm staying at the Brandon Arms, and have one there," admitted Lawrence. "And how long have you been at Brandon Arms?" "5 minutes." "You must be tired of it then, dear," commented Lady Brandon. "I'll send Robert for your things." That evening after dinner, George Lawrence told Lady Brandon all that Major de Beaujolais had told him, adding his own suggestion and theories. As she listened, her eyes scarcely left his face, but she offered no opinion and asked only a few questions. Even when the time came for him to leave on the following day, she had not once admitted or even implied that the blue water had been stolen. His own scrupulous care to avoid questioning her made this easy for her. But was it really possible, he wondered, that Lady Brandon's own nephew, Micheals Geste, had actually stolen the stone, and that, regarding it as a family disgrace, she was trying to shield him? It would be so like her. Lady Brandon said, "My dear friend, this is what I want you to do for me. Nothing at all. The blue water is not at Zandernoef, or anywhere else in Africa. Where Michael is, I do not know. What that paper means I cannot tell. Thank you so much for wanting to help me, for asking no questions. But now, good-bye." "Good-bye," said George Lawrence, sorely puzzled, and went out of the door a sadder but not a wiser man. As the car drove away, Lady Brandon stood in deep thought, pinching her lips. "To think of it now," she said. "Be sure your sins. The world is a very small place." And we will continue this story next Thursday or Friday. And thanks for listening to Miss Retro Reads.